Two Horses, author, Lao She, produced by Liang Gu. The first paragraph. 1. Ma Wei walked towards the jade archway with his head lowered. After walking a few steps, I unconsciously stood still for a while. Raise your head, sometimes to the left, sometimes to the right, and take a look. What is he looking at? He didn't want to see anything, and he really didn't see anything. The little thing he was thinking about was like a piece of melted swim bladder glue, filling his heart completely. Not only did he not leave a small crack for the outside things to get through. Even the movements of his muscles were not directed by his heart. His eyes just went out and came back without bringing anything back. He had forgotten the world a long time ago. He wished that the world would be destroyed along with himself, immediately. Why bother looking any further? He was so fierce that he couldn't stand still. After standing there for 2 or 3 minutes, I slowly saw the things in front of me clearly. Ah, today is church, he whispered to himself. In the second half of the week, the jade archway is always very lively. The green grass and the fine sand pavement were filled with people standing in circles. The workers holding red flags stretched out their necks, opened their big black hairy hands, and shouted in a muffled voice like, "Down with the capitalist class." All the bad things in the world are blamed on the capitalists. Even the poor sleep last night was the fault of the capitalists. Next to this red flag is the Conservative Party holding the national flag, with its neck stretched out even longer, because it is wearing a 2-inch high stiff collar. The neck cannot be shortened. Opened his big white hairy hands and yelled with all his strength, "Down with the Socialist Party, down with the unpatriotic spies." He laid all the evil in the world on the shoulders of the workers, even when it rained this morning and during breakfast boiled a rotten egg. It's all the result of workers' trouble. Next to this circle was the Salvation Army with blue flags, beating octagonal drums, playing flutes, and singing hymns endlessly. The more they praised God, the louder the workers under the red flag shouted. Sometimes I am filled with the Holy Spirit. They sang so loudly that the friends under the red flag over there had to curse with words that couldn't be found in the dictionary. Next to the Salvation Army is a Catholic preacher, and beyond that there are several others, those who preach about Indian independence and those who preach about destroying China as soon as possible. Some talked about the revival of the Liberal Party, some talked about nothing at all, and everyone just gathered around an old man with a red beard, looking at each other and laughing. The people standing under the red flag had little clay pipes in their mouths and their hands in their trouser pockets. What was said on stage? They nodded in approval of something. Standing under the national flag and listening to the lecture, most of them were wearing small hard-shell black felt hats, nodding and smacking their lips, muttering, "That's right." No. Sometimes 2 people said something right at the same time, "That's right." Yes. They winked at each other and grinned. A 10th smile emerged from the corner of his mouth. As for the small circles, they are not as neat and consistent as these big circles. Most of them focused on discussion and debate, putting their heads together like sheep and talking to each other in low voices. In addition, there is a group of young men wearing hats on one side and with stern eyebrows. They go around these small circles, making witty remarks and making jokes, for no other reason than to make everyone laugh and show off their subtleties. Outside the circle were patrol policemen in groups of 3 or 5, all standing tall on one side. They are equally lavish, as if the policemen in London were all brothers from the same mother. The most prominent among this group of people, the ones who are called Hao, are the Imperial Guards in red uniforms. Their backs are straighter and flatter than a drawing board. The middle seam of the trousers stood straight as if there was an iron rod propped up inside. All of them are clean and tidy, with a smile on their face, showing their white front teeth, and their hair is cut just enough to expose their green scalp. They don't listen to anything. Guang stood in the most eye-catching place outside the circle, his eyes darting around. After standing there for 3 to 5 minutes, I don't know how I got the energy, so I put my arm on the girl's white wrist, then stamped my heels, and they went to have a heart-to-heart talk on the grass. Among the men and women on the green grass, some were sitting face to face, some were lying with their arms around their necks, and some were sitting alone with an evening newspaper, not reading the newspaper, but looking at the girl's legs. Groups of fat dogs were jumping around with joy and biting inexplicably. The children, some dressed in white cashmere and some in red velvet jumpsuits from head to toe, were all running around on the grass with their fat legs. The nannies were wearing little white hoods. He ran after these little gods with a nagging voice. Ma Wei stood for a long time, not interested in listening to the lecture, nor could he think of where to go. He seemed to be about 22 or 3 years old. Not short in stature, but very thin. He has a yellowish-white complexion and is thin, but not obviously weak. The 2 long eyebrows are slightly raised upwards. The corners of his eyes are also hanging up a little. Without those big eyes that are always smiling, his face would be a bit scary. His eyes are very dark and very bright. The blend of black and bright makes the edges of his black eyes lighter. Just enough to prevent the black and white eyes from being as clear as the paper figurines covered with paper. A nose that is not very high, because the face is not very fat, it looks just right for the height. The lips were raised a little, and they were harmoniously connected with his smiling eyes. Judging from his appearance and age, it seems that he should not be so sad. However, his eyebrows were knitted, his head was lowered, and his spine was slightly bent. His youthful and lively demeanor was indeed somewhat lost. He was wearing gray woolen clothes and a black woolen cloak. His clothes were very well made, but he didn't touch them, and it looked like his face had lost a lot of its original splendor because of the decadence. Comparing him with those young men wearing red army uniforms holding girls' arms, he was really a bit unlucky. Unintentionally, he took out a handkerchief and wiped his face. After wiping, he still stood there stumbling as usual. The sun was almost setting, and patches of red clouds illuminated the green velvet-like grass into purple. The workers' red flag slowly turned into a frozen piece of purple blood. The number of people attending the lecture became increasingly rare. Ma Wei put his hands in his coat pockets, took only a few steps forward, and leaned against the iron railing on the edge of the grass. The red clouds in the west slowly dispersed the remaining light of the sun. First, it was covered with light grape gray layer by layer. With the last bit of reflection from the sun, it looked like the layer of gray with bluish frost on the neck of the wild pigeon. This gray is getting darker and darker. Invisibly connected with the fog circles on the ground, all the colors on the ground were swallowed up into darkness. The workers' red flag also turned into a black dot. The big trees in the distance quietly hugged this layer of darkness and walked away into the night together. People came and went and almost dispersed. The gas lamps on all sides were lit. The big red and green cars were running in circles around the jade archway. Looking from a distance in the fog, it looked like a moving rainbow. There is no one on the grass anymore. There's just a dark shadow next to the iron railing. 2. Li Zirong had already gotten out of bed. I was stretching my legs to the left and moving my hands to the right. When I was half asleep, I seemed to hear the doorbell ringing. My eyes were just about to open. But his head couldn't help but slip under the pillow. I still remember vaguely in my heart, something made a noise just now. But... crack! The doorbell rang again. He opened his closed eyes a little bit. Then he slowly brought his ears and lips closer to the pillow. Squeak! The ghost is calling the door in the middle of the night. Who is it? He sat up with one hand on the mattress, and with the other hand he opened the curtain a little and looked out. Although there are gas lamps in the alley, the fog is thick. The black cage was so dark that nothing could be seen. Crack! The sound was a little heavier and longer than the last time. Li Zirong got up. He put on his shoes in the dark, and the cold soles touched the hot sweat on the soles of his feet, and he couldn't help but get goosebumps all over his body. Even though it was the end of April, it was still cool at night. He fumbled to turn on the light. Then he put on his big cloak and walked downstairs on tiptoes without showing any air. The old lady downstairs had already slept. If I accidentally woke her up, would be scolded. He opened the door gently and asked, "Who is it?" His voice was so low, as if he was afraid of scaring the thick fog outside. Old Ma? Why are you ringing the bell so much?" Ma Wei was speechless. He came in and walked upstairs. Li Zirong carefully locked the street door. He followed Ma Wei upstairs without saying a word. As he approached the door of his room, he stopped and listened. There was no sound at all from downstairs, and he thought to himself. Fortunately, the old lady didn't wake up. Otherwise, tomorrow's breakfast would be half bread and half scolding. Both men entered the house. Ma Wei took off his cloak and put it on the back of the chair, but still said nothing. "What's the matter, old Ma? Are you arguing with the old man again?" Li Zirong asked. Ma Wei shook his head. Under the lamp, his face looked even more yellow and ugly. His eyebrows were wrinkled so much that they looked like water droplets appeared. The eye sockets are a little blue, and there are some small beads of sweat on the tip of the nose. "What's wrong?" Li Zirong asked again. After waiting for a long time, Ma Wei sighed, licked his dry yellow lips again, and then said, "I'm so tired, Lao Li. Can I stay at your place for one night? There is a bed right here." Li Zirong pointed to his bed and said with a smile, "I'll take this recliner." Ma Wei lowered his head and said, "At least we can deal with it overnight, and it will be easy to deal with tomorrow." What about tomorrow? Li Zirong asked. Ma Wei shook his head again. Li Zirong knew Ma Wei's temper. If he doesn't say it, there's no point in asking. Okay, Li Zirong scratched his hair and said with a smile, you go to bed and I'll take care of this recliner. After that, he spread felt on the chair. But one thing is that you have to leave at dawn, don't let the old lady downstairs see you. Okay. Sleep with you. No, Lao Li. You go to sleep, I'll just endure it on the chair for a while. A slight smile appeared on Ma Wei's face. I'll leave at dawn, I'm sure to leave. Where to go? Li Zirong saw Ma Wei's smile and wanted to cover up his words again. Tell me. Otherwise. No need to plan on sleeping this night. You got angry with the old man again, didn't you? Don't mention it. Ma Wei squealed. I didn't want to come to you, but unfortunately I didn't leave tonight, so I had to come to disturb you. Go there, exactly. Li Zirong saw that Ma Wei would never go to bed, so while talking, he carefully wrapped his own cloak and felt around Ma Wei. Then he turned off the light and got into bed again. Germany, France, maybe. Dash. Are you going to do some business for the old man? Father doesn't want me anymore. Li Zirong grumbled in agreement without saying anything else. Both of them were silent. The street was extremely quiet, with only the whistles of trains and ships in the distance. The sound was loud and no other sounds could be heard. The church clock at the back of the street struck 2 o'clock. Aren't you cold? Li Zirong asked. It's not cold. When Li Zirong was going to bed, he kept thinking in his mind, get up early, don't let the old horse run away. Get up, wash your face with cold water, write a note to the old lady downstairs, and tell her. If you have something urgent, you don't have to wait for breakfast. Then go out with him and send him home. Yes, it is better to go to the shop. When father and son meet, they will be too embarrassed to cause trouble in the shop. It's common for father and son to quarrel. Young, old horse. Too honest. He kept thinking like this in his dream. The milk truck in the alley started to ring loudly, and the sound of cars on the street became more and more loud. Li Zirong suddenly opened his eyes, and the sun had already penetrated a golden thread through the cracks in the curtains. Old horse. The felt cloak was stretched on the back of the chair, but Ma Wei was nowhere to be seen. He got up, opened the curtains at the back, put on his cloak, and stood by the window blankly. Looking out the window, I'm looking at the Thames. There are no walkways on the river bank yet. The boats on the river are all active. The small trees on the shore have just sprouted light green leaves, and a layer of light mist surrounds the treetops. The sun shines on the young leaves from the thin fog, and stars shine like small light green beads just fished out of the water. Almost all the big boats on the river had no sails, only a few small boats hung with white sails, swaying in the middle of the big boats, like a few big white butterflies about to fall on the flowers. The morning tide is rising. The rolling waves are covered with a layer of golden scales by the sun. The higher places, the golden light is squeezed out one by one. The crushed gold stars are covered by the waves again when they fall. Stir up a bunch of little white flowers, really white. Just like the tender white pulp just squeezed out from the dandelion stem. The farthest little sailboat was moving slowly, and the river waves were still chasing it forward, as if the golden dragon was trying to drive away the little butterfly. Rushing back and forth like this. The small sailboat turned the bend of the river. Li Zirong stared blankly at the small sailboat turning the bend of the river. Then he stopped and walked to the front window facing the street and opened the window. Then I wanted to tidy up the things on my desk. There is a gadget on the table, shining brightly. There is also a small note under this little thing. He picked up these things together and felt quite cold. Slowly walked to the couch, sat down, and read the words on the note carefully. There are only a few words, written in pencil. The strokes are twisted here and there, as if they were written in the dark. Brother Zirong, thank you. A small diamond ring for the Wenda girl. Goodbye. Wei. Second paragraph. 1. This incident should now go back 1 year from the day when Ma Wei left Li Zirong. Pastor Yi is an old teacher who has been teaching in China for more than 20 years. He knew everything about China, from Fu Shi's hexagrams to Yuan Shikai's appointment as emperor, one of the things he liked to hear most. Apart from not being able to speak Chinese well, he can be considered a book with legs. Encyclopedia of China. He really loved the Chinese. When he couldn't sleep in the middle of the night, he always prayed to God to quickly turn China into a vassal state of the United Kingdom. He told God with tears in his eyes, if the Chinese don't let the British control them, these people something with a yellow face and black hair. There is no way I can ascend to heaven. Pastor E walked east along Oxford Street. Although he was over 60, he still walked quickly. From sunrise to midnight, Oxford Street is always crowded with women. The shops on this street, except for a few cigarette sellers, almost all of them sold women's items. When they come to this street, no matter what urgent matter they have, they will not move forward 2 steps in a minute. There are red and green hats, leather shoes, small gloves, small suitcases on display in the shop. They all have a special suction that sucks their eyes, bodies, and souls together. Pastor Yi's religious dignity will be reduced by at least 99% on this street, a big step forward. That high and obstructive nose had to touch the old lady's small umbrella. When he stepped back, the sole of the big leather shoe, he was always worried about rubber soles, would most likely be resting on the girl's little toe. Reached out and took out the handkerchief. The elbows must be placed in the small bamboo basket carried by the woman. Every time he walked down the street, he would at least change into an undershirt and 2 handkerchiefs when he got home. As for, I'm sorry, and, I didn't pay attention, I always say at least 180 times. It was easy to squeeze through Oxford Circle. He took a deep breath and said, "Thank God." He put more energy on his feet and kept walking eastward. Beads of sweat flowed down from the snow-white temples as if the snow had melted. Although Pastor E is over 60 years old, his back is still straight. Not much hair. But it's all white. He has no beard, and his cheeks are cleanly shaved. If there were no wrinkles on his face, he would look like 2 tea green tiles. 2 big eyes, resting on a pair of small yellow eyes. There are two fleshy ribs hanging above the eyes. About 20 or 30 years ago, I also had eyebrows growing on my forehead. There is a pair of small glasses placed under the eyes. Because the nose is too high, the distance between the glasses and the eyes is 2 inches, so it is much easier to see things from the top of the glasses frame than from the middle of the glasses. The lips are very thin, and the corners of the mouth hang down a little. When he was preaching, his 2 small yellow eyes were fixed on the frames of his glasses, and his thin mouth was drooping down. It really made people tremble without speaking. But when I usually meet people, he is very kind. A preacher cannot get anything done unless he has 2 faces. Arriving at Museum Street, he turned left. Pass through Tao Lington Courtyard and enter Gordon Alley. There are many Chinese students living in the alleys in this area. Chinese people in London can be roughly divided into 2 classes. Workers and students. Most of the workers live in East London, Chinatown, which is the most embarrassing place for Chinese people. Germans, Frenchmen, and Americans who have no money to travel to the East always go to Chinatown to take a look when they come to London, in order to find some materials for writing novels, diaries, and news. There is nothing out of the ordinary about Chinatown, and the workers who live there don't do anything extraordinary. Just because there are Chinese people living there, they want to take a look. Just because China is a weak country, they just give it to those hard-working people. Chinese people looking for food in foreign lands are charged with all the crimes. If there were 20 Chinese living in Chinatown, their records must have numbered 5,000, and these 5,000 yellow-faced ghosts all smoked cigarettes, smuggled arms, and made dead people hide their bodies under the bed. Anyone who rapes women, young or old, and does anything that deserves at least death by 1,000 cuts. Those who write novels, dramas, and movies all describe the Chinese people based on these legends and reports. Then watch plays, movies, girls, old ladies, and children reading novels. And the British Emperor kept this unreasonable thing firmly in their minds, and the Chinese became the most insidious, filthy, disgusting, despicable 2-legged animals in the world. In the 20th century, people are treated in relation to state. People in strong countries are people, but what about those in weak countries? Dog. China is a weak country, but what about the Chinese people? Yes. Chinese. It's time for you to open your eyes and take a look. It's time to open your eyes. It's time for you to straighten your back. It's time to stand up. Unless you are willing to be dogs forever. Chinatown has such a good reputation, so of course Chinese students will not be popular. Larger hotels will not rent Chinese people, let alone decent people. Only the houses and small hotels behind the British Museum can still be rented to Chinese. It's not that the people in this area are particularly kind-hearted, it's that they are used to eating Orientals, so they have to change their long faces and have to deal with these yellow-faced monsters. Just because a chicken seller raises chickens doesn't necessarily mean he loves chickens. Why do British people love Chinese people when they rent houses to Chinese people? Number 35 in Gordon Alley is the house of Widow Wendu. The house is not very big, a 3-story building with only 7 or 8 rooms in total. There is a green fence blocking the door. 3 levels of white stone steps. Brush until there is no dirt at all. A small red painted door with a polished steel ring. Upon entering, there is a small living room. Behind the living room is a small dining room. Go around this small dining room and go down the stairs to find 3 small rooms. There are only 3 rooms upstairs. 1 on the street and 2 at the back. Pastor E took off his hat when he was still far away from the little red door. I wiped the sweat from my face and straightened my tie. I felt that I no longer had any shortcomings on my body, so I gently walked up the steps. He stood on the steps for a while longer. Then he knocked on the door knocker 2 or 3 times with the same lightness as a musician trying to sound check on the piano. A series of thin footsteps ran down the stairs, and after that, the door opened slightly, and half of Mrs. Windu's face was exposed. Pastor E. How are you doing? She opened the door a little wider, stretched out her little white hand, and touched Pastor Yi's hand gently. Pastor E followed her in, hung his hat and cloak on the hangers in the corridor, and then followed her into the living room. The small living room is really neat and tidy. Even the small copper nails on which the paintings are hung seem to be smiling. There is a rectangular green blanket spread in the middle of the room, and 2 not very large couches are placed on the blanket. There is a small coffee table against the window. On the coffee table is a small 3-color Chinese porcelain vase with 2 small white roses. On both sides of the coffee table are 2 oak chairs with green velvet cushions. There was a small piano placed in front of the inner gable, with 2 or 3 photographs placed on the piano cover. There is a small paint stool placed in front of the piano. Lying on the stool was a fat little poodle. Seeing Pastor E come in, he jumped down in a panic, wagging his head and jumping around between the old pastor's legs. There is an oil painting hanging on the wall along the door, with a pair of small magnetic discs on both sides. There is a small bookshelf under the painting, which contains some collections of poems and novels. Widow Wendu sat on the small stool in front of the piano, with the little white dog jumping in her arms and tilting her head to tease Pastor E. Pastor E sat on the couch, pushed up his glasses, and began to praise the little white dog. After praising for a long time, he slowly said, "Mrs. Windu, is the room upstairs still vacant? Isn't it?" She held the dog in one hand and handed the cigarette dish to Pastor E with the other hand. "Do you still want to rent someone?" he asked while holding a cigarette. "Only those with the right skills dare to rent." She answered with the measurements. "There are 2 friends who are eager to find a house. I do know they are reliable." He glanced at her over the frame of his glasses and said the word "sure" very clearly and vigorously. He paused for a moment, lowered his voice, and drew a circle around his nose to make him smile, too. "A Chinese person," he mentioned the word China. His voice was almost loud enough for her to hear. 2 very honest Chinese people. "Chinese?" Widow Wendu said with a straight face. "A very honest Chinese." He repeated again and glanced at her secretly. "Right? I guarantee it. If you have any mistakes, tell me." He quickly took over the words before Mrs. Wendu finished speaking. "I really have no place to find a house for them. Mrs. Wendu, you have to help me. They are father and son, and the father is a Christian. Look at God. For my sake, you have to. Pastor E deliberately stopped talking. See what happened to, for God's sake. But Mrs. Wendu didn't seem to take God to heart at all, with more than 1,000 impatient looks on her face. Pastor E interrupted before she could finish speaking. Even if I ask them for more rent. Seeing that they are wrong in forcing them to move, I will no longer He felt that what he was about to say did not seem to be in line with the genre of the Bible, so he took a puff of the cigarette and swallowed the cigarette and the words together. Pastor E. Mrs. Wendu stood up and said, "You know my temper. Many people in this street have made a fortune by renting foreigners. I am almost the only one left here. I would rather make less money than rent foreigners. I feel very proud of this. Why don't you find them housing elsewhere?" Who said he didn't find it? Reverend E said with a very embarrassed look, "I have asked about Tao Lington Courtyard and Gao Wei Hutong from the door, and the houses are not suitable. I just think that the 3 small rooms you have upstairs are just right, just enough for them to live in. 2 rooms are used as their bedrooms and 1 is used as a study room. How nice. But priest." She took out a small handkerchief from her pocket and wiped her mouth. In fact, there was no need to wipe her mouth. Do you think I can ask 2 Chinese people to cook rats in my house? Chinese people don't, he was about to say, Chinese people don't eat rats, then he thought. Saying this is clearly a small nail in the coffin for her. Can she still rent the house? So he quickly changed his words. Of course I told them not to eat mice. Mrs. Wendu, I won't waste your time anymore. Let's put it this way. Rent it to them for a week and see if they are not good. Tell them to move. As for the rent, it's whatever you say. They couldn't afford to stay in a hotel, and I didn't want to ask 2 Chinese people to deal with them. We are all true Christians, and we have to endure some hardships to help them. Mrs. Wendu rubbed the long hair under the puppy's neck with her hands and was silent for a long time. I kept thinking in my mind, is it better to pay more for rent, or is it better not to serve the Chinese who kill people, set fire to eat rats? After thinking for a long time, I still couldn't decide. I was afraid of freezing Pastor E, so I had to respond smoothly. They don't smoke opium either? No. No. Pastor E said 3 times in succession. She then asked countless questions about China that she had gleaned from novels, movies, plays, and rumors spread by missionaries. After digging around and asking, I got to the bottom of things. After asking, I regretted it again. By asking like this, doesn't it mean that I already intend to rent the house to them? Thank you, Mrs. Wendu. Pastor E said with a smile, that's it. £4 and 15 shillings a week. Take care of breakfast and dinner. They are not allowed to use my bathtub. Right. I told them to go out and take a shower. After Pastor E finished speaking, he didn't even bother to tease the puppy anymore. He grabbed his hat and cloak and ran away. He ran to the street and found a quiet place before whispering. Oh shit. For 2 broken Chinese. 2. The Ma family and his son boarded a ship from Shanghai and arrived in London in a fool's errand. Mr. Ma struggled to get up after being at sea for 40 days. Once, as soon as I stepped out of the hatch, the boat tilted outward and fell over. Without making a sound, he held the hatch and went back. When I got up for the second time, the ship had docked at the London pier motionless. Mr. Pony is much better than his father, but when the ship passed Taiwan, his head felt a little dizzy. After passing Hong Kong, there was no problem at all. We have already seen what Mr. Pony looks like. The difference is, when he was on the boat, he was not so thin, and his brows were not so wrinkled. It was my first time to go out on a sea boat, and everything seemed fresh and interesting. I leaned against the railing of the boat. The splashing sea breeze made his face turn red, and his heart was almost as happy as the sea water. Mr. Ma is not over 50 at most, but he always shows a dejected look, as if a person who lives to 50 should not move around or pick up grass. Eating and sleeping all day, eating even after sleeping, taking one more step seems unreasonable. He is a little shorter than his son, and his face is much thicker than Ma Waifutai. He has heavy eyebrows, a round face, and a black beard like a small crescent moon on his upper lip. In the past year or two, there have only been a few pale ones. His eyes are the same as Ma Wei's, big, bright and beautiful. He always wears big glasses with tortoise-shell rims. He is neither nearsighted nor farsighted. He wears big glasses just to make people look older and more powerful. Mazarin. This is Mr. Ma's name. When he was young, he studied at the Methodist English School. I remember a lot of English words and memorize grammatical definitions very well, but I always get at most 35 points in the exam. Sometimes I hold the English-Chinese dictionary. Pull the classmate who got 100 points to a quiet place. Come. Let's do it. You ask us 50 words, and I ask you 50. I want to teach you what a clever way you got 100 points. Son. Then the hero who scored 100 points stared blankly. He put the dictionary in his crib and muttered "nunis." The shame of getting 35 points was wiped away, and the snow was completely gone. He is from Guangzhou and was born in Beijing since childhood. He always tells people that he is from Beijing. It was not until the value of Dr. Sun Yat-sen's Three People's Principles increased and the power of the Guangdong national government expanded that he printed the words, Guangzhou native, on his business cards. After graduating from a missionary school, he hurriedly found a wife. Rely on some ancestral property. With the help of his brother, the young couple lived a happy life with one heart and one mind. He had taken the college entrance examination several times, but he could not write a good jizzy, so he had to give up the hope of writing records. I asked someone to find a foreign job, and my English was not up to par. Someone recommended him to teach English in a school. If he had a strong ambition to be an official, he would be willing to use a cane stick as a small teacher. When I had nothing to do, I secretly went to have a whore. I came back late, and the young couple sometimes bickered. Fortunately, it was at night, so no one knew. Sometimes he stole his wife's gold ring and pledged it, but he always smiled and promised to buy her a new one if his brother sent him the money. She scolded him with half annoyance and half a smile, but he was happy and told her everything about losing the bet. Ma Wei was born more than 3 years after the marriage. Mazarin wrote to his brother beforehand asking for money in preparation for the full moon celebration. The brother's money really came, so all the relatives and friends had a hard time on the 30th day of Ma Wei's birth, even the neighbor's four-eyed dog. I also nibbled on the pig's feet and fish bones. Now the status of the young couple in the world is much higher, because they have changed from husband and wife to parents. Although they do not think very carefully about their responsibilities as parents, their dignity and status as parents must be shown. So Mr. Mazarin left the hair on his upper lip unshaved, and in 2 or 3 months he actually developed a small black beard. As for Mrs. Ma, she lightened the rouge on her face by half to complement his little black beard. The most painful thing, when Ma Wei was 8 years old. Mrs. Ma, whether she ate too much or caught a cold, died. Mazarin was extremely sad. Leaving an 8-year-old child behind with no one to care about it was not a big deal. I got married without getting an imperial title for my wife. How sorry for the dead soul. I couldn't help but the big tears flowed down one after another, making my mustache cry like the little sugar brush selling honey twists. Everything for the funeral was paid for by my brother. No matter whose money it was, I had to give it to the dead ghost decently. Take 3 and put the flame out. The funeral was much more lively than the full moon in Ma Wei. Over time, Mr. Ma's sadness decreased. Relatives and friends are all trying to find a new home for him. He also had this intention, but choosing a girl was really not an easy task. A second marriage is not as easy to deal with as a first marriage. Now he finally has experience with women. The good-looking ones have to be taken care of, and the bad-looking ones have to be taken care of. It's the same thing, so why not a good-looking one? However, there are so many beautiful women in the world. This problem of restringing was not easy to solve. Once we almost succeeded. Someone was talkative and said that Mr. Mazarin was lazy and unproductive, so the woman gave up. Another time, when I was about to succeed, someone told him, there are 3 stars on a woman's nose, which is like the long 3 in the dominoes. But again, who can get a wife with long 3 on her nose? There is another layer. The only thing Mr. Ma can do to bring glory to his ancestors is to serve as an official. Although Guaner has never done it before. But the piety of being an official will never let up. Any opportunity to become an official should not be passed up easily. A second string is also an opportunity to get an official position, so naturally one cannot just pat the head on the head and count it out. Suppose you marry the daughter of an official. Relying on my father-in-law's strength, why don't you do some errands? If. He had a lot of what-ifs, but the ifs were just ifs after all, and they never became a fact. If I could marry the chief executive's daughter, I wouldn't even have a boss when I was young, he often told people. Suppose the president had a daughter. I can marry you, but you can't. People answered him like this. There is no hope for marriage or officialdom. After Ma Wei finished reading the 3 short books and the 4 books at home, Mr. Ma sent him to a church school in Xiqinggo because there is accommodation there. Save yourself a lot of trouble. When he had nothing to do, Mr. Ma often went to the church to see his son. During these visits, Pastor E said that he had revitalized his heart and actually baptized him into Christianity. I have nothing to do, I just go to church and hang out, which is pious and doesn't cost money. After baptism, I did not play cards or drink alcohol for more than a week. I also bought a red-cover English Bible for my son. In the year when the European War ceased, Mazarin's brother went to England to engage in the business of selling antiques. I always send some money to my brother every 3 to 5 months. Sometimes I would ask him to search for some goods in Beijing. Mazarin was born to look down on traders, so he bought his brother a few ancient vases, small tea bowls and the like. Every time I go to Lulikang to buy these things, I always go around Xianmen Bridge to drink a few bowls of rice wine. Have a meal of fried triangles. Mr. Ma's brother died in England and left a will to teach his brother to come to London to continue his business. By this time, Pastor E had been back in England for 2 or 3 years, and Mr. Ma wrote him a long letter with the English-Chinese dictionary in hand. Ask him whether he should go to England or not. Pastor E is naturally happy to have Chinese believers come to the UK so that the British can see that missionaries in China do not just eat and get money but do nothing. He replied to Mr. Ma with a letter asking them, father and son, to come to England tens of millions of dollars. So Mr. Ma took his son to Shanghai and bought 2 second-class ferry tickets, 2 suits of foreign clothes, a few tubes of tea, and some odds and ends. When the ship left the river mouth, Mr. Ma took off his big glasses and lay down in the cabin, not daring to move at all. I also felt that all my internal organs were turning upwards. 3. Although the junior officers in the British Customs Service all look different, they all have a certain sense of style. Anyone with eyes can tell what they do at a glance. Their eyes are always looking at people. The other one looked at some old torn charter books. The pencil is always half cut, stuck in the ear. The nose is always wrinkled with a few folds, so that every part of the face is obviously busy and extraordinary. They are very kind to their own people. While checking passports, they joke and make witty remarks. When they meet women, they talk a lot. The attitude towards foreigners is different. The shoulders are lifted up, the corners of the mouth are pulled down, showing full imperialism. Sometimes they also smile slightly. After laughing, you will no longer be allowed to land. After the passports were checked, they got off the boat with everyone, deliberately rubbed their hands and told you, the weather is very cold. Then they praised you for your good British speaking. The passports of the Ma family and his son have been inspected. Mr. Ma had some official documents from his brother, and Mr. Ma had a study abroad certificate from the Ministry of Education, so he passed there without any trouble. After checking the passport, go for the physical examination. Neither Mr. Ma has any internal diseases, nor are they suffering from tuberculosis or other injuries. So I passed the test safely again. And the doctor told them with a smile, eat more beef in the UK, and your health will be better. In this European war, the UK was able to defeat Germany because the British soldiers ate beef every day. The physical examination is over. The father and son opened the boxes again and asked others to check the things. Fortunately, they brought neither opium nor arms. They only had a few pieces of silk clothes from Mr. Ma and a few tubes of tea, which were taxed at £10. Mr. Ma didn't know why he brought these treasures, and he didn't know why he had to pay taxes. He poked his mustache and paid the money in a daze. After completing all the formalities, Mr. Ma almost fainted. He said to himself, he had known it would be so troublesome. I won't come to a foreign country if I want to die. After getting off the boat, we got on the train. Mr. Ma leaned against the corner of the car, said nothing, closed his eyes, and fell asleep again. Ma Wei looked out the window. No place high or low was flat, and the high hills were green. The places where the depressions go down are also green. The train was running so fast that I couldn't see anything else. Only this uneven green land followed my eyes. Wherever I looked, it was green. The train went faster and faster, and the uneven green land gradually turned into a green wave that fell and fell. There are some cattle and sheep in the distance, like flowers of various colors floating on the spring waves. There are fewer and fewer green spaces and more buildings. After a while, the car moved much slower, and the lane became streets on both sides. The whistle blew twice and the car entered Livestock Street Station. Mr. Ma was still asleep like a little bodhisattva, and suddenly grinned, probably talking in his sleep. There are so many people on the platform. Hey, this way. The porter greeted the guests while pushing the cart. Hey, over there. The husband called his wife, shaking his hat. The car over there has started. People on the bus and on the platform nodded to each other, waved handkerchiefs, and in a puff of black smoke, the car disappeared. Newspaper sellers, flower sellers, and cigarette sellers all pushed their carts around without saying a word. The British have the same attitude when doing business and attending funerals. Ma Wei pushed his father awake. Mr. Ma snorted and was about to go back to sleep when a girl walked out carrying a purse and opened the door hard. The corner of the purse hit him on the nose. The girl said, "I'm sorry," and Mr. Ma touched his nose and finally woke up. Ma Wei moved the boxes and other things in a hurry and was about to walk out of the car when Pastor Yi jumped up and came up. He didn't bother to hold hands with Mr. Ma, picked up the biggest box and walked out. You guys came so quickly. Didn't you suffer at sea? Pastor Yi put the big box on the platform and asked Ma and his son. Mr. Ma slowly got out of the car with a small box in his hands, as if he was getting off a large sedan from the road platform in Chingching. How are you, Pastor Yi? He also put the small box on the platform and said to Pastor Yi, How are you, Mrs. Yi? How is Miss Yi? Yi? Pastor Yi picked up the big box again before Mr. Ma finished asking him, Ma Wei. Move the box over here. Except for that suitcase, you take it, bring the rest over here. Mawinu followed Pastor Yi to move all the boxes to the luggage room. Mr. Ma didn't hold anything in his hand, so he slowly turned around. Pastor Yi wrote the list of things to be stored on the counter, asked about the price, and then said to Mr. Ma, Give me the money. Tonight, all the boxes and everything will be delivered to you. Is this easy or not? Mr. Ma gave the money and was a little worried. Can't the box be lost? That's right. Pastor Yi glanced at old Ma with his little yellow eyes, and then said to Ma Wei, Are you hungry? No. Mr. Ma quickly took over the words. The first thing he said was, it would be too inappropriate to complain about hunger just after arriving in England. The second reason is, asking Pastor E to spend money to treat guests makes me feel uneasy. Before he could say the word hungry, Pastor E said, come on. Eat whatever you want. Not hungry? I don't believe it. Mr. Ma was too embarrassed to be polite anymore, so he whispered to Ma Wei in Chinese, he wants to treat him, so don't refute his face. Their father and son followed Pastor E and squeezed out of the crowd to the platform. Ma Wei straightened his back, as straight as a coffin board. With a stiff neck, he walked forward calmly. Mr. Ma had his hands folded, the back of his coat was lifted up a little, and he was shaking it slowly and respectfully. There were 2 or 3 taverns under the large glass shed outside the platform. Pastor E led them into one. He picked a small table, sat 3 people around it, and asked them what they wanted to eat. Mr. Ma still said he was not hungry, but his stomach kept growling. Ma Wei was not as polite as his father, but he was new here and didn't know what to expect. Pastor E saw it. Asking was useless, so he came up with an idea. How about this? A glass of beer and 2 pieces of ham bread for each person. After saying that, he went to the cabinet to ask for it. Ma Wei stood up and helped bring the wine and bread. The old horse didn't even move, saying in his heart, spend money to eat. You have to fucking bring it yourself, huh? I don't usually drink. Pastor E picked up the wine glass and said to them, I just like to drink half a glass when I meet friends. When he drinks in China, he always secretly hides it from his fellow believers. Today I was drinking with their father and son, and I had to explain this. He downed half the glass in a fit of anger, and started praising the cleanliness of the pub to Ma Wei, and then praised the orderliness of Britain. After all, this is old Britain. Ma Wei, do you see that? Ah. He chewed a mouthful of bread. I rubbed it carefully with my dentures, and it took me a long time to swallow it. Ma Wei, are you seasick? I don't think it's wrong, Ma Wei said. Father never got up. What am I talking about? Mr. Ma. You still say you're not hungry. Ma Wei, go get your father a glass of beer again. Ah. Give me another drink, too, so I can drink and have fun. Mr. Ma, I have found a room for you. I will take you there when I come back. You have to have a good rest. Ma Wei brought them another drink. Pastor E drank it down in one gulp and kept saying, drink and have fun. After the 3 of them finished eating, Pastor E asked Ma Wei to send back the wine glasses and plates, and then said to Mr. Ma, 1 shilling for each person. No, we both had 1 more glass of wine, and Ma Wei was 1 shilling, you are a 06, and you still have some change? Mr. Ma really didn't expect this trick, and said to himself, it's just a few shillings, and it doesn't cost you a pastor, so you're not a pastor. He was deliberately playful, trying to set up Pastor Hui Yi's account. No. No. When you go to England, do it the British way. You can eat your own food, and you won't let me. Pastor E said. The 3 people left the tavern. Pastor E took out 6 coppers and handed it to Ma Wei. Go and buy 3 tickets, 2 coppers each. Say, British Museum, 3 tickets, okay? Ma Wei only took 2 copper coins and took out 4 himself. Go to the small window hole pointed by Pastor E to buy a ticket. After buying the ticket, Pastor E was happy. Good boy. Do you understand how to buy a ticket? After saying that, he dug inside his clothes for a long time and took out a small map. Ma Wei, here you go. Look, we are now on Luopu Street. Do you see this red line? 4 stops further is the museum. This is the London Central Tunnel train. Remember, don't forget. Pastor E led the 2 horses down the tunnel. 4. Mr. Wendu has been dead for more than 10 years. He only left a small house and some stocks to Mrs. Wendu. Whenever Widow Wendu thinks of her husband, she always wets 2 or 3 pieces of her 2-inch square handkerchief. Except that he didn't die on the battlefield and didn't leave her millions in property. She had nothing dissatisfied with her dead husband. But these questions come to mind every time my husband cries. If he died on the battlefield, in addition to getting the honor of sacrificing his life for the country, at least she would not get a child pension. Even if the pension is not as good as millions of dollars, it can still buy her a few new hats and a few pairs of long silk socks every year. She can also drink a bottle of beer or something like that on Sundays when she doesn't feel like going to church. Shortly after her husband's death, Europe started a war. Firstly for patriotism, and secondly to make money, she went to work as a typist for a gasoline company. At that time, there was a shortage of people everywhere, and she could earn £3 a week. While typing, I suddenly think of men, or I hate that men die early. Missing this opportunity to serve the country with all her heart, her tears fell with the keys of the typewriter. If he were still alive, he would have killed around 180 German soldiers at worst. What if the Kaiser is captured alive? Didn't he get promoted to marshal, and she still couldn't be the marshal's wife? The more she thought this way, the more she hated the Germans, as if Germany deliberately started the war after her husband's death, and deliberately prevented Mr. Wendu from gaining the reputation of a soldier. Kill the Germans. Leave no chickens or dogs behind. Think about it this way. The typewriter under my hand made a very powerful sound. When I finished typing, I found that it had made several small holes in the paper. I had to start typing again. Miss Wendu is half the age of her mother. After leaving school, he went to a training center for 6 months to learn how to sell hats. How to place a hat in the glass window, how to try the hat on the head of the girl and wife. After leaving the seminary, I found a job in a hat shop in London, earning 16 shillings a week. Widow Wendu had a little money left during the war. After the war, she only helped out for 10 days and a half when the company was short of people, so she was always at home more and less time out. When Miss Wendu was studying, mother and daughter were always harmonious. What the mother said, the daughter listened to. After Miss Wendu went to work in the hat shop, the relationship between mother and daughter was not as good as before. Mother and daughter often quarreled. Tell her to go to hell. You yellow-haired little thing. Mrs. Wendu said to the puppy with tears in her eyes. Finished. He also asked for a mouth on the dog's pointed ears, and the puppy sometimes cried a pair of tears along with it like a fool. The issue of mealtime was a big reason for the two of them to quarrel. Mother has rules and timing for everything. My daughter was working outside for the first time, and she always had a few shillings she earned in her small purse. When she came home, she would spend a few minutes at the candy cellar, a few minutes outside a tailor's shop, and a few minutes outside a jewelry store. While reading, I thought, just wait, your salary will gradually increase. Buy that pack of leather candies in a red box, buy that big shirt with green silk embroidery. The more I watched, the more I loved watching. The more I loved watching, the less I liked leaving. I completely forgot about going home. Not only did I come back late, but after dinner, I immediately put on my little hat and flew out again like a little bird. Her mother must have known that her daughter was going out with her boyfriend, which was not a novelty. What she was unhappy about was that the girl came back at night and told her mother everything about going out with the man. After that, we also talked about marriage issues and divorce issues. The conversation came and went without any restraint. One time when Pastor E came to see them, Miss Wenda selected some long letters from her lover and read them to the old pastor. The pastor originally came to persuade Miss Wenda to go to church on Sunday, but when the girl read them without waiting to persuade her, he picked up his hat and ran away. When Mrs. Wenda was young, she also enjoyed this kind of love life. But her ideals are different from her daughter's. The hero in her mind is one who can kill a tiger with one punch and knock down a wild elephant with 2 kicks, but when he sees a woman, he becomes alluring and charming. All kinds of flattery. As for women, they always have a thin waist and small hands. They faint easily, and when they faint, they always fall on the hero's arms. Such a heroic beauty can only say intimate words in a quiet place in front of the flowers under the moon. Secretly asking for a mouth in the woods. Nowadays, Miss Wenda's ideals and experiences of love are completely different from this novel, How to Travel 80 Miles in a Car with Your Lover After Getting Married. Why go to the court for divorce if you are not compatible in temperament? Why do you want to marry an Italian cook, so you can go to Italy to see if Mussolini has a beard? Or you can marry a Russian and go to Moscow to have a look. It is specifically designed to see whether the skirt of a Russian woman covers her knees, or whether she is simply bare-legged and does not wear a skirt. Since the death of her husband, Widow Wenda has sometimes wanted to remarry. The biggest difficulty in remarrying is financial problems. Men who have no income are simply afraid to win over them. But she had never mentioned this difficulty to anyone. The sweetness of love must be touched in secret. Even if you think about financial problems, you have to try to wrap it up with a layer of love. Go. Go. Marry that Russian ghost. Mrs. Wenda was anxious. Just tell her daughter. That's right. It must be cheap to buy leather in Moscow. Ask him to buy a dozen leather jackets for me and change one every day to see if they look good. Ah. Mom. Miss Wenda asked Zhao away. Mrs. Wenda said nothing and went to sleep holding the puppy in her arms. Not only does Miss Wenda have different views on love than her mother, but she also wears clothes, hats, and beads in different ways. Her concept of beauty is, the newer everything is, the better. As long as it is new, it is good. It doesn't matter whether it is beautiful or not. The shorter the clothes, the better. The more fashionable the hat, the better. According to her opinion, her mother's clothes should be cut off by at least a foot. Not only the brim of her mother's hat is too big, but the long petals on the hat are even more ridiculous. My mother always talked about the quality of the materials. When the daughter opened her mouth, she knew something new was going on in Paris. As they talked, mother and daughter got stuck again. My mother said, "If you buy that little eggshell-like hat again, you won't have to eat at the same table as me." The daughter replied, "If you still wear that old country green jacket, I won't go out on the street with you." The looks of mother and daughter are also different. Mrs. Wendu's face is long, sliding down from top to bottom, and only a small pointed triangle is left on her chin. Her light yellow hair already had a few white strands, which were tied into two buns on her head. A pair of yellow eyes, a small pointed nose, and a small thin mouth. Only when he smiles can he reveal his handsomeness. Not tall. He looks even shorter when wearing a wide-brimmed hat. Miss Wendu stood with her mother. She was a head taller. Compared with her mother's thin and pointed feet, those big feet seemed like they were not from the same family. Because the feet are noticeably smaller. She always buys leather shoes that are one size too small for her feet. When the shoelaces are tied, two small meat buns protrude from the top of her feet. Mother's steps look like a little rooster pecking at grains of rice, making her look very cute. When my daughter walked down the road, there was a thumping sound. Even the flesh on his face trembled. Looking up from the feet, this pair has long